Hello everyone, I'm AJ and welcome to lesson 1 of the CSSG Education Team. In the previous video, I talked about the basics of HTML and CSS for describing the structure and the style of the website. And I also introduced the first project, which is to create your very own website, your very own personal portfolio website. So I actually followed the steps for this particular assignment or for this project, and I filled out the HTML file, and my website looks something like this. So it has my name, it has my picture, it is a sample headline, it also has some text here, my coursework, and also some favorite things in a table. All right. Now, this website works and it contains all the information it needs to, but it doesn't look that great, and we need to add some style to this web page. And so we can do that in the CSS file. And in this video, I'm going to be walking through the steps that I take to turn this website into something that looks a lot better using CSS. In the previous video, I talked about the basics of CSS. However, I didn't necessarily go into actually how to use it. And I think a live demonstration would be very helpful as you're working on your portfolio. So if you notice here, I put my photo in a folder called images, and then I have my, the headshot photo right here. All right. Now there's also a styles folder, and in the styles folder is my style.css file. And this should be in your directory even when you clone the repository initially. This should be here. And you'll see that it's an empty file with 3 comments, right? And you can tell these are comments because they're green, and this is the syntax to create a comment in CSS. Remember, comments, don't actually run as code necessarily, but they allow you to write some extra information about the document you're working in or about different code chunks, etc. Right? So here I have some steps, but I'm just going to do everything kind of down here in step 12 as I work on my website, right? And so the first thing here is you can see that I have my website like this, right? Now, oftentimes when you're working on these type of websites, you often want to align some of your text to be centered, right? So for example, most of the time when you have a header and you have, an image, and then you have these headlines and about education coursework, a lot of this stuff, generally should be centered, right? And so I can now use some of the things that I talked about in the previous video on trying to style these different elements, right? So you can see here on our webpage, we have our first element, which in this case is my name, and this is an H1 element. You can see that if I go to the HTML file that this is an H1 element. Now, another really cool thing which you can do in a lot of browsers, I'm using Safari, but Chrome has this too, is if you right click and press on this inspect element, this will open a pane which will actually show the HTML of your document. And if you press on this button right over here, it allows you to actually see every element individually. For example, I can click on this element here, and you'll see that it is an H1 element. Like if I highlight over this, you'll see that it says H1, right? This is a heading, and it also shows the area that it takes up on the screen, right? Blue is the content, and then this orange around it is actually the margin. And you can see that down here in the box model. So you have your normal content. Then you have something called padding, which basically means that there's space between the content of your H1 and then the border of the H1. You can see the border is out here, right? So padding is if you are trying to, add some space between the start of the element or the content of the element and the border that the element has. And then you have margin, which is referring to the space kind of between another element outside of, your H1 and then the start of the H1 element and its border. So you can see that my file automatically gave me a little bit of margin around my H1 element because I didn't actually specify that in CSS, right? And now I can add some styles to this H1 element. So to remember how to do that, well, if I go to my CSS, and I guess first, it's also good to know that your CSS is connected. You can see that you can connect your CSS file using this link tag, right? Rel, or the relationship, is a style sheet, and the href, which is the reference, right? That's the link, is the styles folder /style.css, right? So in here, what I can do is, well, I want to style all of my H1 elements. In this case, there's just one H1 element. And so to do that, I can select it by typing H1 and then adding these curly braces. Right? This selects the H1 elements and now allows me to put a specific style for all of the H1 elements. All right. Now, what style do I actually want to apply? Right? That is kind of the first question here. What style do I want to apply? Well, the first thing I said is, well, I want to somehow center my text, right? And so there's this great style called text align, right? And you can see as I'm typing, this VS Code gives me a lot of autocomplete options, which are really good. So in this case, I can use text align. And if I click on it, you'll also see even more options. You have center and justify left, right. Basically, a lot of the same text alignment settings you would use in something like Microsoft Word are available here in CSS as well. And since I want to center my text, I can simply press on center. Now, if I were to save my CSS file, go back to my website and refresh the page, you will now see that my H1 element, which is my name, centered on the web page. And this changes depending on the width of the window. I can now do the same for all my other elements. So in this case, I have my H2 elements, which are my about, right? The about, education, coursework, and favorite things. These are all H2 elements. And there's also this headline, which is an H3 element. So I want to center all of these. What I can do is I can, again, select all the H2 elements, and I can say text align center. And I can also select all my H3 elements and say text align center. And now if I save and I refresh, you will now see that all of these elements have been centered, right? And that is really good. The website is beginning to look, I guess, somewhat remotely better now, all right? And so now, another thing you will notice very clearly is that this image is very off-center, okay? And so we need to somehow center an image. Now, there isn't necessarily a very clear way to do this. There's not like a single CSS kind of, I guess, rule or property that allows you to immediately center this particular image. However, there are a few things that we can do, right? And first off, we can begin to talk about the display property of CSS. And I've actually pulled up the W3 Schools webpage on this. And you can see that display basically changes the way that your image is shown or your element is shown on the web page, right? So you have all these different values of inline, and then you have block, contents, flex, grid, etc. And this is all much more complicated CSS, which you'll probably learn later on in the future, but it's not something that is necessarily required to know right now. However, the main thing which you do need to know is that we want to make sure that our image is displayed using the blocks display property, right? We want to display it as a block element, right? Where it starts on a new line and it takes up the whole width. This is really important because our image, if I were to inspect element, right, and I were to select it, you will see that it only, the blue area only takes up the image, right? It doesn't take up the entire width of my page. If I were to highlight, for example, this H1 element, you can see that, yeah, the content, is there in the center. However, the actual, the bounds of the entire H1 go all the way from edge to edge. So centering it becomes easy because now we can center the content within the bounds of the entire element, which takes up the entire width. So we need to apply the display, or we need to apply the block display to our image, right? So what we can do is I can now type in image because this is the only image and we're selecting it. We can say display block, right? And now if I were to refresh, right, you'll see that nothing changes, but now when I highlight, right, you will see that now the element goes from one side of the page to the other. Now, centering it becomes much easier. How do we do that? Well, if you notice, the content is blue, and then the margin is this orange color, right, going off to the right side. Well, what we want to do is we want to make the margin on both sides of my image equal. And by making it equal, the image will automatically center itself in the center of the web page. Right? So to do this, what I can do is I can apply a left and right margin. So I can say margin left, margin left. That is how to create a left margin. And then there's also the margin right. So margin right. Now, what is the actual value? Well, there are many types of values. We can do percentages, right? For the percent of the width of the screen. You can do pixels, you can do various things. But we're actually just going to select auto. Something really cool is that by essentially selecting auto, it's going to automatically choose our margin. And by making it auto, or both of these auto, it's going to make them both equal. If I refresh my page now, you will see that my image moves to the center. And if I were to look at this box model and select the margin, you can see that it automatically selected margins of 410 and 410 for me, right? And that will always stay the same. So that is something that is really cool. Now my image is centered, right? But what if I want to actually round my image? Right now it's a square. What if I want to make it round? Well, to do that, there's a really cool, I guess, property called the border radius. If you remember, the border right here, which again, if I highlight over it in the box model, it doesn't necessarily show it. But if I were to just highlight over the, over the content, there's no padding, so the border is at the edge of our content, right? That is our border. It is a square. But if we add a radius to it, we can make it rounded. And so if I type in border radius, you'll see that that is an option. And now there are many things I can do, like pixels. But percent is talking about the width of my image, right? So 0% doesn't do anything. However, if I want to make this a circle, right, then the radius, remember, radius goes from the center of the image over to the side. So if I want my radius to be to make this a circle, then I want my radius to go from the center here of the height to the center here of the width, and that'll make it completely circle. So what I can do is I can make my border radius 50% because my radius should be half of the width and height of my square image. If I refresh the page now, you will see that my image is now a circle, right? And that is really cool. All right, so now we've begun to make some changes. Now we can look here and we can see there might be a few more problems here. But one thing you'll definitely probably notice is the fact that, well, this text right here and here goes very close to the edge of the screen, right? Like it's barely at the edge here, it's barely at the edge here. Oftentimes we don't actually want to have, we don't want to have things very close to the edge. Usually we want to add some space. And so we can think about the different ways that we can do that, right? And you might be thinking of, well, let's say that I have my body, right? This is my body of my entire, my entire page, right? And we have this thing called margin, right? And if we increase our margin, then our entire body will begin to shrink, right? Like there should be then space on either side. However, this does work, but it's important to consider that our body, that's our main body of our web page. Right? It's not really contained within anything per se, to where if you add margins, it's probably not a good idea. But remember about this thing called padding, right? Because padding adds space within the border of the body, but it still, adds space between the border and all the content. So my content, which includes all of my text, right, goes all the way to the edge of the border, which is the border of my screen, because this is the body tag. So by adding padding, I can add space to both sides. So what I can do is I can actually select my entire body, right? And now I can add padding. So I can say padding left because I want to add it to the left and right. So padding left and also padding right. And now what do I want to do? Well, you could do a specific pixel amount. That works too. Like let's say I want 100 pixels, right? And 100 pixels, I can do that. But I'm actually just going to make this 10% and 10%, right? And what this means is that there's going to be 10% of the web page on this side, will be, I guess, there'll be a padding of 10% of the width and then 10% of the width. If I refresh now, you will see that all of my text moves inward, right? And it's 10% on either side of my web page, right? I like this. I think that this is pretty good. However, you can always, decrease the margin decrease the padding or increase the padding depending on what you wish to do, all right? Now, another thing that we can do is we can see here that this table is very, very strange here, right? Something doesn't really work on this table. And what we can do is we can, use our inspect element, and you can see that our table, right? If I just select it, and, if it's hard, like let's say a table has, all these elements in it, you can actually go to the HTML and just click on it, and you'll see that I have this, I have my padding here, I have my, all my content, that is the blue color that's showing up, but I want to make this centered. And what I can do is I can actually do something very similar to the image, where I simply make my margin left and margin right auto. So I can select my entire table, and then say margin, so margin left auto, and margin right auto. If I refresh and refresh my page, you'll see that now my table is centered. Now, this still doesn't look that great, so we probably have to do something about this. And the first thing is you'll notice that this is a table, but it literally has no table border, right? When you have a table, usually you want lines in between all your cells of your table. And so we can do that by selecting all of the elements. And if you recall, the way that our table is set up is that we have H1 elements, right? So we have our TR, which is our table row, and then we have TH and we have TD. And those select each element. So we want to add a border around all of these. However, when we do this, we actually also want to apply our border to the table. So what I can do is I can say table, comma, TH, comma, TD. And this is another way of selecting elements. If you want to apply the same style to many different elements, you can use this comma convention and it will select all three together, right? So I want to add a border, so there is a border property. Now border is a little bit different. So border actually requires 3 parameters. Most require only 1, but this requires 3. So the first one is going to be the border width. In this case, we want our border to be as small as it can be, which is 1 pixel, right? Sorry, we don't need a space. And then we can say that we want it to be solid, right? Now solid is referring to the type of line. You can have a solid line, you can have a dashed line, dotted line, etc. We're going to have a solid line, and we're going to make the color black, right? And now if I refresh or save and refresh, you'll see that now I have a border, right? But you'll also notice that, well, I have a border around my table and I have a border around all my elements, but it's kind of weird. There's like, double lines here. Well, there's another property that we can use called border collapse right down here. And if we say border collapse is collapse, refresh, now you can see that, all of my elements in my table there's a line in between all of them like it should be, and there's no double line, and everything looks, pretty good here. Now, another thing that we can do is we can probably center our classes. Like if you go back to our HTML, you'll see that all my classes have this p tag. What you can do is you can select, you can select all your p tags and you can say text align center. However, what that'll do is it will also center, all of these elements, which you only want to center your coursework. So if you recall back from the last video, we can use something called a class, and we can set our p tag to have the same class, which is going to be courses in this case, because these are our coursework. So rather than selecting all of the p tags, we can select only the p tags that have the class, that is, in this case, courses. So I can say courses right here. Now remember, when we are selecting a class, we have to start it with a dot or a period. So we have to say period courses. If we were using IDs, you would have to use the pound symbol. So now if I refresh, you will see that my text here and here is still left aligned, but now my coursework is centered. Now this looks decently good. However, the last thing we want to do is we want to change our font, right? This is Times New Roman. We don't really want Times New Roman. So how do we select a font and apply a font to our entire document? Well, what I can do is you can go to something called Google Fonts. Now, Google Fonts is great because it allows us to look at all these different fonts and select fonts. And Google Fonts actually allows us to, or it basically gives us the CSS that we need to apply it, which is great. Now, there are various types of fonts here. There's actually one that I already selected, which is called Poppins. Now, there's also all these different languages for some reason that it can select here. As you can see, it's giving me a lot of languages, but you can select your continent being Americas and language being English. And now you'll be able to see you'll be able to see it in English here. And what you can do is you can select this by, you see all these styles, right? I can select all these styles by pressing the plus button here. And then if you click on the button on the top left, you'll see that these are all of my selected styles. And lastly, you will see that you have this use on the web and you have this link, right? And then you have all these the HTML elements, and then you have a CSS element. So if you just copy all your HTML elements that are listed here and you just paste it in to your head, just like that, right? You will see that now I am essentially linking to Google Fonts. So remember, the head of your document or the head of your HTML file allows you to connect to other things externally. I'm connecting to Google Fonts here using these 2 links, and then I'm connecting to this very specific font, my Poppins font, using the final link element. And now what I can do is, you see here, CSS rules to specify family. I can copy this in and apply it to my entire body. And it will now change all my font to Poppins. And what here is written sans serif, this is actually going to be your alternative font. So if for whatever reason Poppins can't load due to some internet issue, then then it will just automatically show in sans serif font. And now if I save, go back to my website and refresh, you will now see that my new font has been applied, right? So you can see how far we have come, right? We went from having, and in fact, I can show you the difference. If I just comment all this out, all my CSS out, you can see I went from this site, which, is literally just the bare bones, right? To, right? I have this site and I went to this site, only with the power of CSS. Now, you might be wondering, how did I know all of this? How would I know? Let's say I want to learn CSS. How do I learn all of these various different, all these parameters you can add? And this is something that comes with both practice and just, general familiarity with the language, because there are a lot of strange things with CSS and a lot of people get confused with how CSS works and all the various different parameters. It's not like, Visual Studio, it'll autocomplete for you, but it won't really tell you too much. That's why I really recommend W3 Schools. If you just search up W3 School or W3 Schools CSS and you just click on here, you'll see all the different, options for CSS, and it's very good to look at this website. It's a great reference tool. In fact, you can see here CSS reference, all the different elements, right? Background color, border we used, border radius is probably here, right? So if you want to look up how border radius works, you can see that it specifies how it works, how you can apply borders, to certain corners and, all of that. And so I highly recommend this resource, and I'll link it in the description below. Now, I do apologize, this video was quite long, and also this video came a little bit late, but I hope that you all had a wonderful fall break, and I hope that this video kind of helps gain a little bit of familiarity with CSS and maybe even give you some ideas on how you can implement CSS on your very own portfolio websites. If you have any questions, feel free to message me, make a comment on the video, or, talk in the Slack channel, and I will gladly help you. And also, if you have any cool ideas or you have any questions on how to implement certain ideas, definitely ask us as well. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful day.